I didn't notice when the relationship became quiet. Not at first. If anything, I remember thinking things were good. That's probably the part that still confuses me when I look back. Because when something ends, you expect there to be a clear reason. A moment. A mistake. A shift you can point to and say, that's where it changed. But with us, it didn't happen like that. It was slower. Quieter. Almost like the relationship didn't end. It just faded into the background. And I kept living inside it without realizing that something important had already moved. I think about the beginning sometimes. Not every detail. Just the feeling of it. That part is still clear. We met in a way that didn't feel unusual at the time. But somehow, everything that followed felt specific. Like it belonged to us. I remember the first time we had a real conversation. Not the small talk. The kind that stretches a little longer than expected. We were sitting outside a cafe. Late afternoon. That in-between time where the day hasn't ended yet, but everything already feels softer. I don't remember exactly what we were talking about. Something simple at first. But then it shifted. I asked her something about her childhood. I don't even know why I asked it. It just came out. And she didn't answer right away. She paused, looked down for a second, and then she started explaining something in a way that felt careful. Like she was choosing her words, but not hiding behind them. That moment stayed with me. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. It felt real. And I think that's what pulled me in. That feeling that something real was happening between us. Not dramatic. Just honest. After that, conversations came easily. Too easily, maybe. We didn't have to search for things to say. They just appeared. Questions led to other questions. Stories led to more stories. There was always something unfolding. Even silence had weight back then. If we stopped talking for a moment, it didn't feel empty. It felt like something was still there. Waiting. I think that's what I miss the most when I think about it now. Not the excitement. Not even the connection. The sense that there was always something more to discover. That feeling that you hadn't reached the end of the other person yet. Because in the beginning, you never do. Everything is still unfolding. Even the small things. The way they react to something unexpected. The way they answer a question you didn't plan to ask. Those details matter. They make everything feel alive. And for a long time, it stayed that way. Longer than I expected. Even after we had settled into a routine. Even after we started spending most of our time in the same space. The conversations still had movement. They still felt open. But slowly, that started to change. Not in a way that stood out. There was no moment where I thought, this feels different now. It was more like something gradually becoming familiar. Too familiar. Our conversations became easier. At least that's how I interpreted it at the time. We didn't need to explain things as much. We understood each other. We could predict certain reactions. And I thought that meant we were growing closer. That we had reached that stage people talk about, where everything just works. But I think I misunderstood what was happening. Because there's a difference between understanding someone and no longer being curious about them. And I don't think I noticed when that line started to blur. I just remember one evening. We were sitting on the couch. The same place we always sat after dinner. There was something playing on the TV. I couldn't tell you what it was. She was on her phone. I was half watching, half thinking about something else. And at some point, I looked over at her. Not for any specific reason. Just instinctively. And I realized we hadn't said anything in a while. Not a few seconds. Long enough to notice. But it didn't feel uncomfortable. That's what made it strange. It felt normal. Like something we had both accepted without thinking about it. I remember considering saying something. Just to break the silence. But nothing came to mind that felt necessary. So I didn't. And the silence stayed. That moment didn't feel important at the time. But I keep coming back to it now. Because I think that's when something started to shift. Not in the relationship itself. In my awareness of it. After that, I began noticing small things. The way our conversations stayed on the surface. Work. Plans. What we needed to do the next day. Practical things. Necessary things. But not the kind of things that opened something new. We stopped asking questions that didn't have a clear purpose. Stopped going in unexpected directions. And again, it didn't feel wrong. It just felt efficient. Like we had figured each other out. And once you believe you've figured someone out, you stop looking for more. That's what it felt like. Like we had reached the end of something. But not in a dramatic way. More like finishing a conversation and not realizing it was the last one. I remember a night when we went out to dinner. A place we had been to before. We sat in the same section. Ordered similar things. The waiter even recognized us. It should have felt comfortable. And it did. But there was something else underneath it. something I couldn't quite name at the time. We talked. Of course we talked. But the conversation moved in familiar directions. There were no pauses where something new appeared. No unexpected questions. No moments where I thought, I didn't know that about you. Everything felt known. And I think that's when the first real thought formed. Not fully, just something quiet. There's nothing left to discover. I didn't say it out loud. I don't even think I admitted it to myself completely. But the feeling stayed. And once a feeling like that appears, it doesn't really go away. It just becomes easier to notice. After that, I started seeing it everywhere. In the way we spent our evenings. In the way we talked. In the way we didn't talk. Everything had a rhythm. A pattern. And patterns are comforting. Until you realize they don't change. There was one moment that stands out more than the others. We were driving somewhere. I don't remember where. Probably something routine. Groceries. Errands. Something like that. The radio was on quietly. And she said something about her day. I listened. Nodded. Responded. And while she was talking, I noticed something strange. I already knew where the conversation was going. Not the exact words. But the direction. The tone. The conclusion. And when she finished, it landed exactly where I expected. I remember gripping the steering wheel a little tighter. Not because I was upset. Because I felt something I couldn't ignore anymore. Everything had become predictable. Not in a comforting way. In a finished way. Like a story you've already heard. You still listen. You still care. But there's no surprise. No curiosity. No sense that something new might appear. And without that, the experience changes. That's when I started thinking about something I hadn't considered before. Maybe the problem wasn't that anything went wrong. Maybe the problem was that nothing went wrong. We didn't argue. We didn't challenge each other. We didn't push against anything. And because of that, nothing new was created. Everything stayed smooth. And smooth, over time, becomes quiet. And quiet, over time, becomes background. That's the word that keeps coming back to me. Background. The relationship didn't disappear. It just stopped being the center of anything. It became something that was always there, but rarely noticed. Like a sound you stop hearing because it never changes. And the strange part is, I stayed. We both did. We kept moving through the same routines. The same conversations. The same evenings. Nothing forced us to leave. There was no reason to. But there was also nothing pulling us deeper anymore. And I think that's what made it so difficult to understand. Because when something is broken, you can see it. You can point to it. You can say, this is what's wrong. But when something becomes background, you don't notice it disappearing. You just notice that you've stopped paying attention. I still remember the night that realization settled in. Not dramatically, just quietly. We were sitting together. Same couch. Same light. Same distance. She said something about a show we were watching. I responded. And then there was a pause. And in that pause, I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. I wasn't really listening anymore. Not because I didn't care. Because I already knew. And once you feel like you already know, you stop paying attention in the same way. That thought stayed with me long after that night. Because it felt honest. More honest than anything I had allowed myself to think before. The relationship hadn't ended. But it had stopped being something I actively experienced. It had become something that simply existed. And I think that's what people don't talk about enough. How something can still be there. And still feel gone at the same time. No conflict. No collapse. Just a slow shift from presence to background. And by the time you notice it, you're already living inside the quiet. Trying to understand when the sound changed. Or if it ever really did. Or if you just stopped listening. I kept thinking about that. About the idea that I hadn't stopped caring. I had just stopped paying attention in the same way. And the more I sat with that, the more uncomfortable it became. Because attention is something you don't really notice until it changes. At the beginning, it's automatic. You listen. You observe. You remember small details without trying. You notice how the other person reacts to things. What they hesitate on. What they say quickly without thinking. All of it feels important. Not because you decide it is. Because it just feels that way. But somewhere along the way, that kind of attention fades. Not suddenly. Not intentionally. It just becomes less necessary. Or at least, it feels less necessary. Because once you believe you understand someone, you stop watching as closely. You stop listening as carefully. You fill in the gaps before they're even spoken. And I think that's what had happened to me. To us. We had replaced attention with assumption. An assumption is quiet. It doesn't ask. It doesn't explore. It just accepts. At first, I tried to convince myself that this was normal. That this was just what long relationships became. less intense, less focused, more stable. But something about that explanation didn't feel complete. Because stability doesn't have to mean absence. It doesn't have to mean that everything becomes background noise. There was one afternoon that made that clearer than anything else. We were sitting at the kitchen table. Late. Not quite evening yet. That soft time of day where everything feels slower. She was telling me about something that happened with her friend. A misunderstanding. Nothing dramatic. Just one of those small things people replay out loud to make sense of it. And I was listening. At least I thought I was. But halfway through what she was saying, I realized something. My mind had drifted. Not completely. I was still there. Still nodding. Still following the general direction of the story. But I wasn't inside it. Not the way I used to be. And I caught myself thinking something that felt almost automatic. I know how this ends. Not in a dismissive way. Just familiar. Like I had heard variations of this before. And when she finished speaking, I responded. Something supportive. Something appropriate. She nodded. Said, yeah. And that was it. The moment passed. And nothing about it seemed wrong on the surface. But internally, something shifted. Because I realized I hadn't actually experienced the conversation. I had moved through it. And there's a difference between those two things. Experiencing something requires presence. Moving through something requires very little. That distinction stayed with me. Because once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. In the way we talked. In the way we sat together. Even in the way we looked at each other. Or didn't. I started noticing how often we were physically close. But mentally somewhere else. Phones. Thoughts. Routine. Always something pulling our attention away just enough that we weren't fully there. And again, none of it felt dramatic. That's what made it so difficult to confront. Because what do you say? There's nothing wrong, but something feels missing. That's not an easy thing to explain. Especially when everything looks fine. I remember one night when we went to bed earlier than usual. No TV. No long conversation. Just quiet. We turned off the lights. Lay next to each other in the dark. And for a while, neither of us said anything. That kind of silence used to feel full. Like there was something shared inside it. But that night, it felt different. Not empty. Just separate. Like we were both there. But not really together in the same space emotionally. And I remember thinking something I hadn't thought before. We're sharing the same moment, but not the same experience. That realization didn't feel sharp. It felt soft, but heavy in a quiet way. Because once you recognize that kind of distance, it's hard to ignore. After that, I started paying even more attention. Not to her. To the space between us. The way it behaved. The way it changed. Or didn't. And what I noticed was this. Nothing between us was breaking. But nothing was growing either. Everything had settled into a fixed shape. A pattern. And patterns, over time, become predictable. And predictability, over time, becomes background. That word again. Background. I started noticing how often I felt like I was moving through the relationship instead of being inside it. Like it had become part of my environment rather than something I actively experienced. And I think that's when the deeper question appeared. Not about her. Not about us as individuals. About the relationship itself. What happens when something important becomes so familiar that you stop noticing it? Not because it's gone. Because it's always there. And the mind has a way of filtering out what doesn't change. Even if that thing matters. Maybe especially if it matters. Because you stop checking. Stop questioning. Stop asking. You assume. And assumption slowly replaces attention. That thought stayed with me for days. Maybe longer. I don't remember exactly when it shifted from a question into something closer to an answer. But I do remember the moment it felt undeniable. We were out walking again. Same path. Same quiet rhythm. We talked for a few minutes. Then stopped. And we kept walking in silence. And this time, instead of trying to fill it, I just stayed inside it. Really noticed it. The absence of anything new. The familiarity. The ease. And also, the distance. And in that moment, something became clear in a way it hadn't before. The relationship hadn't ended because something went wrong. It had faded because nothing changed. Nothing disrupted the pattern. Nothing created a new direction. Everything stayed the same. And over time, the same becomes invisible. It blends into the background. And once something blends into the background, you stop experiencing it as something separate. It just becomes part of everything else. I think that's what happened to us. We didn't lose love in a dramatic way. We just stopped noticing it. Stopped interacting with it. Stopped engaging with it in a way that kept it present. And without presence, Even something meaningful can start to feel distant. I didn't say any of this out loud. Not then. Maybe I should have. Maybe it would have changed something. Or maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. But I do know this. There was no moment where everything fell apart. No point where we looked at each other and said, "This isn't working." There was just a long stretch of time where everything felt fine and quietly became something else. Something softer, quieter, less noticeable. Until one day, I realized I wasn't really inside it anymore. I was just living around it. And once that realization settles in, it doesn't leave. It just sits there, quietly, the same way everything else had become. I didn't say anything right away. Even after that realization settled in, I just carried it, quietly, the same way everything else between us had become quiet. At first, I think I was waiting for something to change on its own, for a moment to appear. A conversation, a feeling, something that would interrupt the pattern we had been living inside for so long. But nothing did. The days kept unfolding the same way. Morning, work, evening, dinner. A few conversations that felt familiar before they even finished. Then sleep, and repeat. And the strange part is, none of it felt unbearable. That's what made it so easy to stay. Because when something hurts, you react. You question it. You try to fix it. Or you leave. But when something is just quiet, you adapt to it. You adjust. You tell yourself this is normal. That this is what stability looks like. That not every day needs to feel meaningful. And for a while, I believed that. I really did. Until I started noticing something else. Not about the relationship itself. About how I felt inside it. There were moments, small ones, where I felt a kind of distance I couldn't ignore anymore. Not distance from her. Distance from myself. Like I wasn't fully present in my own life. I would be sitting next to her on the couch, the same way we always did. And suddenly, I would become aware of everything. The room, the light, the sound of the TV, the way we were sitting. And it would feel like I was observing the moment instead of living inside it. Like I had stepped slightly outside of it without meaning to. Those moments didn't last long. Just a few seconds. But they happened often enough that I couldn't dismiss them. And each time, the same thought would follow. Something isn't moving anymore. Not something is wrong. Just something isn't moving. And movement, I think, is easy to take for granted. Until it stops. Because when something is moving, even slowly, you feel it. There's a sense of direction, of change, of possibility. But when something becomes still, you start to notice the absence of that. I remember one evening in particular. It wasn't different from any other evening. That's probably why it stayed with me. We were sitting at the table after dinner. Plates still there. Neither of us in a hurry to clear them. She was telling me about something she had seen earlier that day. A small detail. Something that made her pause. And as she spoke, I was listening. But I was also noticing something else. Her voice. The way she spoke. The rhythm of her sentences. And it all felt familiar. Not comforting. Just known. Completely known. And I realized something in that moment that I hadn't fully accepted before. I wasn't discovering anything anymore. Not about her. Not about us. And without discovery, I started to feel like I was just repeating something I had already experienced. Like watching the same scene over and over again. Not because it was bad. Because it never changed. That's when the thought shifted into something clearer. This isn't growing anymore. And once I saw it that way, everything else started to make more sense. The quiet. The routine. The lack of tension. It wasn't just stability. It was stagnation. Not in a negative, dramatic way. Just stillness. And stillness can feel peaceful. Until you realize it's permanent. That's when it starts to feel different. That's when it starts to feel like something has already ended. Even if everything still looks the same. I didn't bring it up. I thought about it. Many times. Tried to find the right way to say it. But every version of it felt incomplete. Or unnecessary. Or too abstract to explain. Because how do you tell someone? I think we stopped moving a long time ago. When nothing is technically wrong. There was no event to point to. No moment that justified the conversation. Just a feeling. A slow realization. And that didn't feel like enough. So I stayed quiet. We both did. And that silence, it continued. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into something longer. And everything remained the same. But internally, something had already shifted for me. I wasn't expecting anything to change anymore. I wasn't waiting for something new to appear. I had already accepted, without saying it out loud, that it probably wouldn't. And that acceptance felt calm, but also final in a quiet way. I remember the night I understood that completely. Not emotionally, Just clearly, we were sitting in the living room. Same positions, same light, same distance. The TV was on. Neither of us really watching. And at some point, she said something. A simple comment. I responded. And then there was a pause. And in that pause, I felt something I hadn't felt before. Not curiosity, not connection, just familiarity. Pure familiarity. And I realized something in that moment. There was nothing left between us that felt new. Nothing that required attention. Nothing that asked to be explored. Everything had already been seen. And once something has been fully seen, it doesn't hold the same weight. It becomes part of the background. And that's when it became undeniable. The relationship hadn't disappeared, but it had stopped being something I actively experienced. It had become something I lived around. Something that existed quietly beside everything else in my life. And I think that's when I understood it fully. Not as a question, not as a concern, as a simple truth. We didn't lose each other in a moment. We slowly became something that no longer required attention. And without attention, even something important can fade into the background. I don't remember exactly how things ended after that. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. There was no argument, no final conversation that changed everything. Just a gradual shift, a quiet understanding, and eventually, a kind of distance that no longer needed to be explained. Sometimes I think about it late at night, not with regret, just curiosity about how something can still exist and still feel gone at the same time. How two people can sit next to each other and slowly become less present in each other's lives without ever saying anything about it. And I still don't know exactly when it happened. When the relationship stopped being something I was inside and became something I was just aware of. Maybe it was gradual. Maybe there wasn't a single moment. Maybe it was just a series of small shifts that added up to something we didn't recognize until it was already quiet. I think about that sometimes. About how nothing was broken. Nothing collapsed. Nothing forced us apart. We just stopped noticing, stopped engaging, stopped discovering. And without those things, what remained was still there. But it felt different, less present, less alive, more like something that had already happened, even while it was still continuing. And now, when I sit in quiet rooms again, I notice things more. Small details, pauses, the way moments feel, maybe more than I used to. Because I understand now how easily something can fade without disappearing. How something can stay right in front of you and still become background noise. And sometimes I catch myself wondering if there was a point where we could have changed it. If there was a moment where one question, one honest interruption, one small disruption could have shifted everything. But I don't know. And I don't think I ever will. Because the truth is, we didn't lose the relationship in a way that left something to fix. We just slowly stopped hearing it. Until one day, the silence felt normal. And by then, there wasn't much left to say.